you're going to present. And right now, what I like to say is that the greatest generational challenge we face today is the threat of the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP. Because of the COVID pandemic, America has woken up to what many of us have been talking about for some time, that the CCP is our strategic adversary and will go to great lengths to spread its deception and corrosive influence around the world. I'm proud that on May 7th, Leader McCarthy announced the creation of a China task force to help harmonize congressional efforts to counter current and emerging cross-jurisdictional threats from China. The task force will be looking at a broad range of China-related issues, broken down into 5 pillars: national security, technology, economics and energy, competitiveness, and ideological competition. The China task force will release a report at the beginning of October. It will detail the various threats from the CCP and include many bipartisan legislative recommendations for action. On behalf of the task force, members of Congress on both sides of the aisle were invited to come and share their thoughts and present their legislative recommendations. I look forward to hearing our colleagues' ideas. We must not be concerned about which party one belongs to for good ideas. We need to be united in confronting this challenge together. And with that, now I will recognize Mr. Posey for 5 minutes for his legislation.
Thank you very much, Chairman and members of the China Task Force, for the opportunity to discuss 2 issues of significance to Florida, to my district, to all of your districts, and of course to our national security: the protection of our space launch industry and the life-saving pharmaceuticals. I urge the task force to consider supporting H.R. 6783, the American Space Commerce Act, and H.R. 5982, the Safe Medicine Act. These are bipartisan bills that I introduced with Democrat co-leads. The American Space Commerce Act extends existing space launch incentives for additional 10 years for companies that launch their payloads from American soil. The Safe Medicine Act will help us end our dependence on pharmaceuticals coming from China, which, as you know, places a lower value on safety and has a record of sending contaminated drugs to America. From protecting our space launch industry to keeping contaminated pharmaceuticals out of our country, the common threat is China. China and other countries have taken notice of U.S. market growth in the commercial space arena and are funding their own launch vehicle development, providing direct subsidies to their companies, which compete with and take market share away from American commercial space launch companies. This is not only an unfair trade practice, but a direct threat to our national security. The 2019 report to Congress of the U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission states that China is taking steps to establish a commanding position in the commercial space launch and satellite sectors, relying in part on aggressive state-backed financing that foreign market-driven companies cannot match. The report further states China has already succeeded in undercutting the United States and other foreign launch and satellite providers in the international market, threatening to hollow out these countries' space industrial bases. The best interest of our national security is to stop that. Foreign launch providers are heavily subsidized by their governments and use those subsidies to undercut American competitors, materially harming these American companies and our American industrial base. Another national security interest of the United States is protecting contaminated pharmaceuticals coming from China. 80% of the drugs that Americans depend upon come from overseas countries, including China, whose pharmaceuticals have been subject to numerous recalls, is the largest provider of drugs and drug ingredients. As a result, our complete dependence on China, we have not produced basic medicine like penicillin in the United States since 2004. In 2008, a Chinese-based pharmaceutical company pumped counterfeit blood clot medication into our domestic markets to turn a quick buck. The result, 81 Americans died. 785 more were severely injured. And yet, because officials were afraid of creating a shortage, they allowed the Chinese-made heparin to continue to enter the country without inspecting it. Crises like these keep on happening. When the U.S. Food and Drug Administration testified before Congress in the 2008 contamination crisis, they insisted that we must also remember that this is an essential drug and we can't simply stop the heparin supply. Why couldn't we? Because we are totally dependent on China for heparin. Contamination or not, as a member representing a large population of senior citizens, I can assure you that this is a critical and an issue we must address. To cripple the United States would have to do is embargo. To cripple the United States, all China would have to do is embargo the drug here. China did something similar in Japan in 2010 over a boating incident, I understand. In 2018, the problem has only gotten worse. In 2018, it was discovered that millions of Americans have been taking blood medication tainted with cancer-causing ingredients from China. According to the FDA, carcinogens may have been used in these foreign generics for as many as 4 years before being discovered. Please consider taking an active role in helping us advance these bipartisan bills. H.R. 6783, the American Space Commerce Act, and H.R. 5982, the Safe Medicine Act. The American Space Commerce Act will help our domestic launch industry and keep the United States a leader in space. The Safe Medicine Act will help save American lives and end our dependence on contaminated pharmaceuticals coming from China. Thank you very much for your consideration. I look forward to working with the China Task Force and my colleagues to address these issues that are so important to the American people, and be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Congressman Rosen, for both of these. We've had great testimony to the task force on space, the importance of the Space Force, and also on supply chain as it applies to our medical supply. I think most Americans had no idea that we had such a heavy reliance on China for medical supplies, PPE, 90% of our generics. So your legislation is really the heart of what I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here, sir. And on reference to 6783, the Space Commerce Act, based on your travels and your experience, what was the motivation for tax incentives for actually space launches on the United States soil?
Wow, thanks for asking that. You know, up until the 80s, the United States had a lock on virtually 100% of the world's commercial markets, or launches, commercial rocket launch market. But we choked the golden goose. We overregulated it. We had contracts with commercial providers that made it, you know, very onerous to do business in the United States. The French Ariane rocket, original one, was basically a carbon copy of our Thor Delta. And they blew up at least every third one. But it was still cheaper to launch with the French than it was to go to the United States. So we started losing business to them. And over the next couple of decades, we parlayed that 100% basically of the world's commercial launch market into about 15% for American companies. The other countries subsidize their launch companies. We don't. I mean, if you're a foreign customer launching a satellite from Kennedy Space Center, and you're lucky enough to get approved within 60 days to watch the launch, you're paying $60 million to put up a satellite for you. Then you do it in a musty old blockhouse, you know, dusty, standing up, probably watching the launch, maybe a can of Diet Coke, I don't know, you know. When I went to French Guiana and saw the European Space Agency, they have, you know, all Art Deco, glass enclosed launch control center, surrounded by a semicircle of those big lazy boy recliners, you know, probably 100 of them, that they wine and dine the customers, treat them like kings, and of course their government, you know, cooperates fully with them. So, you know, we have the advantage technologically. We have the institutional knowledge and the experience to be first in space. We just haven't had the support of our government, and we never will have the support that the other governments are getting it. But we at least should go forward with giving some tax incentives if they launch from our soil. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman.
Posey.
Andy?
Oh, sorry. Andy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just real quick question. Representative Posey, thank you for your leadership on this, and especially on the American Space Commerce Act. Very interested in that and might want to co-sponsor it. Really appreciate your leadership on that. I represent a company called Space Tango. They do exomedicine. They provide space on the International Space Station for zero gravity medical experiments. And I just wanted to know, you know, how would this maybe facilitate more of that science in zero gravity environment?
Well, it would definitely help bring costs down to them. You know, those are add-on costs, the taxes, obviously, that the customer ultimately has to pay. And it does hurt things. So, you know, most people don't know at the International Space Station we have real zero gravity that we can't duplicate here. Even with the centrifuge, we can't duplicate it here. But in the true, real zero gravity environment of our International Space Station, you know, they can make pharmaceuticals, they can do drug tests that are 100% perfect. You know, when you do the molecules and put the stuff together here on Earth, there's a percentage of loss from 100% quality that you get. You don't get 100% quality throughout because there's deviations due to gravitational forces that, some of which we don't understand. But the International Space Station, the crystals, 100% perfect. And they get their mutations expedited much quicker up there, so they're faster, and the technology advances faster, and we learn more, and we come up with new products. But it's been a godsend, and unfortunately, most of the United States just doesn't know much about it because it's not a big buzzword in the news all the time. But fortunately, there's people in Congress that appreciate it and respect it.
I appreciate your leadership on that.
Now, Mr. Joyce?
Representative Posey, thank you. Thank you for being here with us today and bringing forth H.R. 5982, the Safe Medicine Act. The China Task Force in the technology pillar have been studying and are keenly aware of the over-reliance on China, on the communist Chinese government, and what they have done specifically, as you had mentioned, in cornering the market on penicillin, ampicillin, amoxicillin. The vulnerability cannot continue. And your legislation is incredibly important and addresses this issue. And I, too, want to look to co-sponsor this with you as well. Thank you for bringing it forward to us today.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you.
Next, we have recognized Mr. Bill Flores, 5 minutes.
Good morning. So, Chairman McCaul, members of the task force, I appreciate you giving me this opportunity to speak to you today and for your leadership to focus on the threats that the Communist Chinese Party has for the United States and our people, not only in terms of threats against our economic opportunity, but our national security. These threats manifest themselves in numerous ways. Today, I want to focus upon the vulnerabilities in our pharmaceutical supply chain and to build on what Mr. Posey was talking about just a few minutes ago. There's little doubt that the worldwide spread of the SARS-CoV-2 Wuhan virus and the resulting outbreak of COVID-19 has laid bare the extreme risk in the U.S. pharmaceutical supply chain. Over the past few decades, we have lost significant capacity to domestically produce our vital and our life-saving medicines. As a result, greater burden has fallen upon the FDA to perform safety inspections on foreign facilities outside the United States under difficult conditions. A recent GAO investigation into FDA's ability to adequately ensure quality assurance through inspection of foreign facilities shows that the agency continues to fall behind on performing routine inspections due to severe staff shortages, among other things. Over the past 2 years, there have been numerous FDA safety recalls of pharmaceutical products from Chinese manufacturers. These pharmaceuticals are the canary in the, or these recalls are the canary in the mine for a problem created by offshoring pharmaceutical manufacturing. This risk must be addressed now by returning pharmaceutical manufacturing to U.S. soil. In May, I introduced the Safe and Secure Medicine Supply for Hardworking Americans Act, H.R. 6885. It is specifically designed to eliminate that risk. The Safe and Secure Medicine Supply for Hardworking Americans Act does the following. It creates incentives to rebuild the U.S. pharmaceutical and medical device chain by incentivizing companies to manufacture their products and their active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, which are the building blocks for most of the pharmaceuticals that we have today, and by disincentivizing the importation of drugs from insecure sources, particularly China and to a lesser extent India. It improves the safety of products by enacting significant civil penalties on both foreign facilities that manufacture tainted medicines and on the folks that import those into the United States. It creates supply chain transparency by requiring the FDA to create a publicly available registry indicating the country of origin for FDA-approved drugs. Here are the highlights of the legislative provisions in the bill. First, the incentive grant program. It creates a secure medicine supply fund and incentive grant program to provide financial incentives to build manufacturing capacity in the United States. The grants may be used to build facilities, train workers, and to develop new products, particularly antibiotics. The fund is financed by monetary penalties on importers of tainted drugs and by tariffs on imported pharmaceutical products from foreign countries. Second, tariffs on imported pharmaceuticals. Tariffs on imported drugs are intended to discourage companies from locating manufacturing facilities outside of the U.S. The bill places a 25% tariff on products from China, 20% on products from India, and 10% on all others. Third, monetary penalties for tainted drugs. Occurrences of contaminated medicines entering the U.S. supply chain have risen significantly in the last several years, particularly from China. And you heard Mr. Posey talk about that just a few minutes ago. To mitigate this problem, the bill penalizes both foreign facilities that produce the tainted products and the entities that import them in the United States. Fines range from $10 million to $100 million per occurrence based upon the frequency and severity of the violations. Fourth, a ban on imports of facilities that produce tainted drugs. So if you've had a facility that's produced a tainted drug, both they and the importer, and the FDA issues a Class 1 or Class 2 recall, both they and the importer will pay a fine. And then, if there's a repeat violation, that facility is not only fined but banned for up into perpetuity from being able to export drugs to the United States. Fifth, transparency. This bill creates an FDA registry of FDA-approved drugs and APIs. The Secretary of HHS shall create a registry of FDA-approved drugs manufactured outside the U.S. that lists the country of origin and each step in the supply chain prior to entering the U.S. It also lists the drugs for which 50% or more of their APIs are manufacturing outside of the United States. And it requires a U.S. label to show the country of origin for each API. I urge the House to quickly consider this legislation to plug a growing gap in an industry that's critical to the health, economic opportunity, and security of hardworking American families. And I'm available to answer questions.
No, thanks, Congressman Flores, and it's an excellent bill. Very comprehensive, I must say, as well. I like the FDA provisions. In terms of incentivizing, I know you talked about grants. What about any tax provisions?
No tax provisions are in this bill. What we've tried to do is remain tax neutral. Now, I'm not opposed to tax incentives. If somebody wanted to come on and add an amendment to this bill to add tax incentives, I would be I'd be supportive of that effort to do that.
So no, in the advanced semiconductor chip industry, we're looking at, refundable investment tax credits.
Right.
So, yeah.
And I would think that would fit nicely into this type of an approach.
That's great.
This came out of ENC hearings that we had last year that talked about tainted drugs. I was able to get those hearings onto the agenda because I'd had a particular blood pressure medicine, the one that Posey was talking about a few minutes ago, that had carcinogens in it.
Wow.
And this pattern continues to repeat. He talked about heparin before. They've had numerous drugs in the last 2 years that have been recalled.
So, very good point. Any members? Yes, Mr. Gonzalez.
Mr. Flores, thank you for bringing this forward. This certainly is a top priority. I think, Frank, it's one of the things that we have to get right, and everybody the country is waiting for it. My two questions. One, with respect to the grant fund, what's the size of that fund? And then the second question would be, with respect to your work on ENC, what's the current status of the bill with respect to support from other members and things like that?
One of the problems that we've seen is that politics has entered into everything that we're trying to do. And so last year when we started this initiative, we had good support from the chair of the Health Subcommittee on ENC. But since then, you'll find no Democratic support for any Republican-introduced bill. I think at the end of the day, the public cares so much about this that we will ultimately find support, but they don't seem to be interested in that at this point. But the American people is spooked by what happened with the Wuhan virus and with COVID-19.
No.
We haven't set the size. The way it's set up is you take all the tariffs on the imported drugs, and then you take all the fines and you put those into a pool, and then the CBO can project that out 5 years, and then that is available. We can have the CBO do some projections on that and what it would be, but it would be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. By the way, the tariffs would not increase the cost of drugs to Americans because the Chinese would do what they've always done. That's reset their currency rates so that they absorb the cost and we don't.
Mr. Joyce?
Joyce?
Mr. Flores, thank you. Thank you for addressing an important issue in this, and that's the country of origin. This is a way that many pharmaceuticals go around the end and bring medicines to us onshore, tainted medicines risky medicines. This is a significant piece of legislation. Thank you for bringing it today for us to discuss. Thank you for your hard work on it as well. In face, this is not a partisan issue. These medicines are taken by all Americans.
That's correct. That is exactly correct.
Now, Mr. Barr.
Congressman Flores, thank you for your leadership on this great bill, and appreciate your attention to this very critical issue. I'm wondering, in your work on this issue and especially on ENC, have you all looked at why there was an exodus of domestic manufacturing of pharmaceuticals in Puerto Rico? And does your bill help to rebuild a pharmaceutical manufacturing base in the territories and especially Puerto Rico?
The reason for the exodus from Puerto Rico is that there was a tax provision in Puerto Rico that allowed U.S. pharmaceutical companies to manufacture pharmaceuticals there and then to sell basically tax-free with no income tax. That provision expired. When that tax provision expired, then you begin to see that plus the regulatory structure in the United States cause the pharmaceutical manufacturing supply chain to leak out overseas, and the Chinese took advantage of that, as well as the Indians. This bill doesn't address that issue, but I would be fine including a provision to help our territories become tax havens, if you will, to produce American pharmaceuticals. That would go well. That would interface well with the tax incentives that Mr. McCaul talked about.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the FDA provisions, grant, and the tax together would be a great solution.
I agree.
We thank you so much.
Thank you
For being here today.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yield back. Thanks for your time.
Thanks. Next, we have Mr. Crawford for 5 minutes. Recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the members of the task force. Before I begin, I have an op-ed that I co-authored with Speaker Gingrich and former Guatemalan ambassador to the United States, Manuel Espina, making the case for renewed U.S. engagement in Latin America. Would ask that be entered into the record.
Yeah, without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. There's been a lot of talk about the need to divest ourselves from a supply chain perspective from China, and I want to put a little bit of a finer point on that as it applies to our own hemisphere. One of the key regions in the process that's outlined in the op-ed that I've submitted is Latin America. I believe there are several measures we can take to stem China's growing influence in our hemisphere. Latin America presents a unique opportunity to move elements of the global supply chain from China while preserving competitive advantage and business environment that made China appealing in the first place to Western companies. This can be done through a combination of tax incentives and infrastructure development in Latin America. I know that a primary barrier to relocating production facilities to Central and South America is the current inconsistent state of infrastructure in targeted countries. Railroads, roads, water, electricity, telecoms, 5G in particular, and other industrial necessities need to be built up, providing ample investment opportunity for American businesses in addition to job creation throughout the region. Another barrier to relocating production and service facilities to Latin America is market conditions and the rule of law. We need to work with countries in Latin America to develop conditions conducive to attracting foreign investment. In doing so, we must recommit ourselves to the spirit of the Monroe Doctrine and keep non-continental powers, in particular China, from being an influence in the Americas. One way we can do this is through the establishment of a Western Hemisphere trade bloc, further linking existing free trade agreements and partners while working to keep outside actors and their behavior at bay. I've heard firsthand from leaders in the region, and the time to act is now. China is exerting unwarranted influence in the region as we speak, as they work to undermine our interests in our own backyard. In the face of this onslaught, our neighbors are urgently requesting our assistance. If we do not answer their call, it will be too late. Second, we also need to work to develop mutually beneficial economic and trade opportunities. As the world's leading ag-producing country, American agriculture is a tool for strengthening our engagement overseas. This can be done through the promotion of precision agriculture technology and research exchanges, the provision of food assistance, as well as market development. American farmers have the ability to stabilize food supply chains globally. We have an overabundance of high-quality food, and we need to ensure that it reaches those who need it most, regardless of location. Such actions with aid in building relationships, open markets, and promote food security. Importantly, will also promote American farmers, who are the backbone of our country. Moreover, I believe such actions will go a long way in demonstrating that the United States is, in fact, a reliable, well-meaning partner, especially at a time when China and CCP have proven unreliable across sectors, yet attempt to boost its own image through its own coronavirus disinformation campaign, for example, mask diplomacy. Finally, we need to understand that food security is national security. It is not a secret that the CCP actively seeks to steal proprietary research and technological advancements from our ag sector, looking for ways to undermine American ingenuity and steal the profits of our labor. To protect our ag sector, I believe we need to take a few steps. We need to protect the academic integrity and agricultural research of American institutions from attempts by the CCP to influence and infiltrate campuses. This involves limiting research visas, not permitting foreign sources of funding for APL universities and professors, and regular screening to ensure academics are not participating in relationships with foreign colleagues and governments that undermine the United States and its security with the 1,000 Talents plan that you've heard about. One other thing I'll leave you with before I finish, we need to also improve the way we collect, analyze, and utilize ag-related intelligence. For instance, USDA could serve as a member of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, in addition to having a dedicated Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence within the agency responsible for collecting and analyzing information, as well as coordinating with the wider intelligence community. I could go on and on. I know I'm running up against time, but I'd be happy to take any questions you have on this topic, and I appreciate the opportunity to present this information.
No, I like the idea of this trade block. I think a lot of people don't realize that through their Belt and Road Initiative that China is in our hemisphere, and they're right next door, and they're in. They've taken over many developing nations in the African continent, certainly in Latin America. And our friendly governments like to stay with us down there, and some are not friendly. Right. Panama Canal, Roosevelt built it, Carter gave it back, and now they've got two ports, on both ends of the Panama Canal. And I think trade agreements would be great incentivizers for better behavior in the region. They've got a choice to pick. It's either China and the Communist Party or the United States when they do business. And oftentimes we get either they underbid us, or they also go and lay the debt traps and leverage these countries into these situations. And I think it's a great foreign policy to use our trade policy to stop this influence that we're seeing all across the hemisphere. So I thank you for the bill. Are there any questions at Denver?
Thank you. I love your idea about a Western Hemisphere trade bloc. So I want to ask a question about it. Do you think we could do almost a hemisphere targeted investment to incentivize infrastructure builds? I think if we further U.S. ability to support economies friendly to us, we're going to be in a good place. And my example is Peru. I was just down there, and now I guess China is Peru's #1 trading partner.
Right.
And when I asked about fiber laydowns beside railroads, they were a little bit reluctant, but they agreed. They finally admitted to the fact that there's being fiber laid down by China, with their railroads. Do you believe we're to a point now, based on analysis or based on what we're looking at, that we need to prioritize our investments in South America, but also in some other places around the world, sort of based on intelligence assets now? And
Absolutely.
I mean, do you think that's where we're going to this point, that when you talk about the Monroe Doctrine, maybe we need a doctrine of targeted, data-driven investment in those countries based on China's economic threat to us, or as far as encirclement? Is that something that would be a good way to go, a good road to go down?
Absolutely, and I think one of the biggest challenges we have in the United States with regard to private sector investment in those countries that we're trying to show good faith with is our own regulatory constraints that we place on our own companies. So, for example, state-owned enterprises like Huawei and ZTE, they go in there without any constraints, and they promise the moon. Whereas, where's the option for these countries? Where's America? Where's Verizon in this equation? And usually, Verizon I use as an example, but usually it's because they're constrained by our own policy or our own regulatory regime that prevents them from being active and being able to go over there and offer the same product. I mean, heck, we're experiencing that here. We don't have 5G rolled out over our own country. And that has to do with our regulatory regime.
I think that's why I love what you said there, because we have China SOEs, but we sort of shackled ourselves.
Exactly.
And China is reaping the benefits of a
They
free
own
market
everything.
economies without having the responsibility to follow the own rules, right, where they're making the money off in South America or any other sort of pseudo-free market economy. So that's why I think it's very exciting what you're proposing here. And I think you're dead on point. I mean, I think this is the way to go down the line, and I'm so glad that you have this bill here. But incentivizing companies, we're never going to do SOEs, right?
Right.
But if we release the shackles, we can use our free market system to sort of defend against the SOEs and that sort of proliferation in those areas where we want to have our own economies of scale in those areas.
Exactly. If I may, just real quick, had a conversation with 2 business leaders in Guatemala last week on a conference call, and they understand that the ticket to this is private sector investment. It's not governments, because the private sector will be around longer than the government will. So to maintain continuity in these investments, they believe that private sector investment and collaboration with companies in countries like Guatemala, but also Peru and Chile and others, are going to be really the way to go for us to really see a measurable impact there against China.
Any other questions? No, Mr. Crawford, thank you so much for your testimony. Next, we have Ms. Ann Wagner. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks to all for being here. And good morning. I want to thank the China Task Force for organizing the critical hearing from the outset, I would say, of this devastating crisis. The Chinese Communist Party suppressed, misrepresented, and falsified information necessary to prevent a pandemic. As a result of the CCP's cover-up, more than 120,000 Americans have lost their lives and millions more have lost their jobs. Congress has appropriated trillions of dollars to mitigate the social and economic costs of China's intentional concealment of the coronavirus, but we do not yet know the full cost. The emergency's long-term effects on the United States cannot be overstated, and I believe that the Chinese Communist Party must pay for the deadly impacts of its actions. The American people deserve the compensation owed to them under international law. Now, international law makes clear, through, frankly, the international health regulations that were agreed to after SARS, makes it clear that injured nations are entitled to seek compensation for suffering caused by the concealment of public health information. Holding the Communist Party financially accountable is the only way to deter the release of another killer virus on the global community in the future, ensure the Communist Party stops violating international law, and provide compensation to the American people and government. Many of my colleagues have called for international lawsuits against China. And, while I strongly support their efforts, I have to tell you that the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act would block that unless it were significantly amended. China has also repeatedly demonstrated that it will not abide by the policies and procedures of international institutions. It has refused to comply with arbitration agreements regarding its illegal militarization of the South China Sea, and it flouts efforts to stop North Korea's nuclearization. We will only be successful in holding the Chinese Communist Party accountable through sanctions and punitive measures that do not depend on China's own consent. That is why I introduced the Compensation for Americans Act, which will establish a compensation fund and instruct the president to freeze Chinese assets to bring the Communist Party to the negotiating table. This is a way to bring them to the table. The United States has used this extraordinary tool in the past to pressure foreign nations that have grievously harmed U.S. interests. President Dwight Eisenhower froze Cuban assets in the wake of Fidel Castro's revolution, and President Jimmy Carter froze $12 billion in Iranian assets during the hostage crisis. And these are just a couple of the examples. These actions help Americans harmed by hostile powers receive fair compensation. The Compensation for Americans Act gives the administration a comprehensive toolbox of punitive measures to further incentivize China's compliance. It imposes a robust sanctions regime targeting Chinese actors that threaten U.S. interests, including Communist Party officials and entities involved in internet filtration, censorship, and surveillance, and individuals that have stolen American intellectual property. The bill also prohibits the export of technologies that can be used to help the Communist Party suppress or distort information. It begins the task of reorganizing America's vulnerable supply chains by prohibiting the United States from buying critical medical supplies from China and investigating ways to help companies move back to the U.S. We've heard a lot of options in that regard from my previous colleagues. It addresses China's secretive activities by suspending Chinese acquisitions of U.S. companies and requiring Chinese companies listed on the U.S. stock exchanges to meet fair transparency requirements. And it prevents China from continuing to manipulate the developing countries' designations to obtain preferential treatment in international organizations. And it allows U.S. companies that have been attacked by Chinese hackers to strike back. Compensation is not a policy of vengeance. It is a policy of security and accountability. It reinforces international norms that keep us safe, and it gives China a helping hand by providing an avenue for the country to restore its legitimacy in the world community. If we want global principles to retain their power, we must stand up to nations that refuse to play by the rules repeatedly. The United States must lead the way in holding the CCP accountable. Americans deserve justice, and the world deserves leadership. I urge my colleagues and this task force to consider and support the Compensation for Americans Act. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Wagner. It's a very intriguing idea. A lot of people, they know that China's responsible, Chinese Communist Party. The question is, how can we hold them accountable? And I think that's precisely what your bill does. We, as you know, our committee, we issued the origins of COVID-19. Very comprehensive. It's on the House Foreign Affairs website. The lengths to which the CCP went to cover this thing up over a period of months, detaining doctors, getting retractions when they were simply telling the truth, as required, as you mentioned, by the international rules developed after the SARS pandemic. They violated that. It was supposed to be in 24 hours. Then they went in and they destroyed lab samples at the laboratories to cover this up. And then finally, the human-to-human transmission lie that was perpetuated by the Chinese Communist Party was parroted by Director General Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, who was complicit with this cover-up. It is absolutely almost, I would say, criminal what the Chinese Communist Party did to the world when they could have stopped it. And they had the Spring Festival in January, where millions of people,
Millions traveled
millions,
all over the world.
5 million traveled out of Wuhan, domestically throughout China, then internationally, went from an epidemic to a global pandemic. Tedros declined his own experts' advice in Wuhan by not declaring it a public health international emergency. Absolutely disgraceful. And the American people and the world need to understand this, and our allies need to understand what they did to the world. So I congratulate you on this excellent bill that actually uses historical precedent.
Correct.
That's been used previously that I think is better than some of the other remedies that we've heard about, because people at the end of the day are they're, once they read this, they're so enraged, they want to know, what are you doing about it? And how are you going to hold them accountable?
And Mr. Chairman, and the thing about the Compensation for Americans Act is we fight them on our own turf with our own tools. They pay no attention to international law, treaties, acts, anything that's been passed. Suing them, while noble, the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act blocks that. So we have control when we're looking at the assets that are here, the sanctioning powers, the other things. And really, to me, this is a way to drive them to the negotiating table. If they want to, if we were to put that kind of pressure from within the United States of America on the CCP, I think they would sit down and we would be able to put together a compensation fund. I cannot tell you how it would be used, whether this is something that the money would go to the U.S. government, it would go to individuals who had lost loved ones. That's not my decision to make, and my point is to drive them to the negotiating table, fight them on our own turf, and I think it's much more realistic. It has a comprehensive list of sanctions and things against the CCP.
And it's something we can do on our own. I think some would say go to the United Nations, and certainly we'll do that. But as you know, when they control most of the key positions in the United Nations, including the WHO. That was their candidate that won, and they tried to take over the intellectual property organization within the United Nations. And thank God Secretary Pompeo and his team were able to fight that. But I commend you for this legislation and bringing it before the task force. And Mr. Barr?
Congresswoman Wagner, Ambassador, thank you very much for your leadership on this. I support your bill. Very important to hold the CCP accountable for its malign conduct. Two questions. One is with respect to the provision to freeze Chinese assets, have you or any agency taken an inventory of the assets that are here that are subject to freezing? And the second question is, have you thought about the anticipated retaliation and how we could, prepare for American assets in China that might be vulnerable to a retaliatory effort in response to your legislation?
Well, thank you for the question, Representative Barr. And I can tell you that part of my frustration is, and it is contained in the legislation, I didn't have time to include it today in my presentation to you all, but no, we do not even as a nation have an inventory, a full and complete inventory of the Chinese assets. It is extremely large, but this would also direct the U.S. to absolutely inventory everything that they own here. And in terms of retaliation, I mean, if killing millions of people around the world, so many here in the United States of America, others that are sick and never going to be able to recover, the economic impact to not just our overall economy, but to families, real people that we all represent. If that's not retaliation enough, I don't know what else to say. To me, the purpose of this, again, is not necessarily at the end of the day to raid those assets. It's a tool to get them to the table, to understand that they have to be held accountable and that some compensation is going to have to be put forward by the CCP.
That's excellent. Any other members? Let me just say also on the developing nation status, this is
makes me crazy.
absolutely insanity. A world economic empire is listed under the UN as a developing nation, qualifying them for loans from the World Bank.
Incredible.
At which they loan to their debt-trapped nations at a usurious rate. I mean, that alone would change so much.
And there's so much in this, and I know that it's really packed, but there may be ways to even take pieces of it as we move forward. But we try to be as comprehensive as we possibly could, and also shining a light on all the abuses, whether it goes to the South China Sea, to developing nation status, to their flouting of international laws.
No, we just saw they violated the Sino-UK treaty. We've got testimony today on foreign affairs by exiles, people living in exile, and in Hong Kong, who now they violated the treaty. They are taking back Hong Kong, and what's next? Taiwan, South China Sea. This has to stop, and I want to congratulate you on an excellent bill, Ambassador, and thanks for presenting this to us.
Thank you all very, very much.
See, next we have Mr. Congressman Budd.
Thank the task force, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having me. For the last 2 decades, most observers have predicted that either the United States or China will own the 21st century. Early on, this competition was just that, a relatively friendly rivalry between two countries that also work together economically. However, in recent years, the actions of the Chinese Communist Party have revealed the true colors of this authoritarian force. They're still our rivals, but they're not our friends, and they are not a force for good in the world. The most obvious example of this is in the COVID-19 pandemic. Evidence continues to expose the Chinese government's purposeful underreporting of their country's infection levels as the virus spread from Wuhan. The highest levels of the Communist Party hid key information about the coronavirus, such as its ability to transmit from person to person, as we spoke about a minute ago, and then spread false information to the rest of the world. That dishonesty cost countless lives, including more than 100,000 Americans, not to mention the crippling of our economy and the loss of 40 million jobs. Fundamentally, the Chinese Communist Party is more interested in preserving their own power and global status than striving to care for the safety and well-being of our own citizens, let alone the rest of the world. Inside China's borders, certain segments of their 1 billion citizens are subject to horrific human rights abuses. The Muslim Uyghur population is the most prominent example. Having a religion, culture, and language that is distinct from the rest of China, Uyghurs have become the focus of massive and brutal assimilation campaigns designed to wipe out any trace of their rich heritage and quash any semblance of resistance to the Chinese government. U.S. and UN experts have concluded that up to 1 million Uyghurs have been forcefully detained in what amounts to political detention camps. Various human rights organizations have concluded that inmates of these camps are subjected to rampant episodes of torture, forced labor, and extrajudicial murders. America has a moral responsibility to use its position as a global superpower to demand justice for the ethnically persecuted. That's why an overwhelming majority of the House supported the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, which levies specific sanctions against the Communist Party officials who are most culpable. China also bullies its smaller neighbors. Hong Kong was once a vibrant, autonomous region with a population of over 7 million, and they began widespread demonstrations in 2019 over increasing Chinese subversion of their judicial system. As protests grew more violent and crackdowns became more and more disturbing, China formally approved a national security law that empowers the Communist Party to essentially eliminate any autonomy between the two entities and put Hong Kong firmly under China's thumb for the first time. On May 27th, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo certified to Congress that because of China's new law, Hong Kong is no longer autonomous from the China mainland. China's COVID-19 cover-up, their concentration camps, and their forced expansion into formerly free regions make plain that they are not a force for good on the world stage. They seek to dominate and undermine the freedom and economic prosperity of democratic republics, and then lie to the world in order to cover it up. Moving into the 2020s, the United States needs to treat them like the adversary that they are. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Budd. I couldn't agree with you more. They are, I think, as Secretary Pompeo states, in the long term, the greatest threat to our national security. And they are a foreign adversary. We thought we could be friends with them. For decades, we tried. I talked to Secretary Baker the other day. He said, look, we wanted to bring them into the family. He said, but we failed. But I would say the Chinese Communist Party failed, their own people. They are the ones who did not want to join the world family and rather perpetrate these awful human rights violations that you speak about. We have addressed this on the floor. And we passed both the Uyghur Bill, but also the Hong Kong Democracy and Human Rights Act that the Secretary used to decertify the autonomous nature. Now we see the PRC, Chinese Communist Party, moving into Hong Kong and essentially invoking martial law. They arrested 180 people last night with an eye towards winning their elections in September. Getting very aggressive. But I really like this. This is a big part of the focus of the task force are these human rights violations. The idea that they're taking Uyghur women now and sterilizing them and forcing abortions to kill their own children. as they sit in concentration camps is absolutely nothing we've seen like since the Holocaust itself. And these are concentration camps, as the Department of Defense has stated. So I really, this is a great bill. I would ask, my question would be what sort of sanctions provisions you have in this bill?
This is actually not legislation. This is a framework through which we should offer all other legislation. And I want to just associate myself with your comments. We, for 50 years as a country, we have worked to bring China into the fold for the betterment of the globe. And this is what they do to the world, and this is what they do to their own people. So I want to just point, I mean, there are several pieces of legislation that I've offered, including, and this reiterates some of what some other members have offered, including Representative Flores, is protecting our pharmaceutical supply chain from China Act. So there's lots of legislation. I'm hearing more and more good legislation coming from members that needs to be pieced together, but it's part of a larger framework to realize that China is not our friend.
So that's very good. Any members have any questions? I think this really, when we talk about moral authority, if we can't call this out, then you know, it cries out for this legislation, the moral authority we have to condemn the human rights violations that are taking place. And thank you, sir, for coming before us here today.
Well, it's a bipartisan issue, and it's a global issue. Thank you.
Yes, and most of these, just about all these bills are bipartisan. Which is, we asked the Democrats to join us. They were with us a year ago. They chose to leave the table for whatever reason. I don't view this as a partisan issue. I think it's an American issue. And this is a policy exercise, not a political one. And it's unfortunate that they're not here today. But we have an open invitation to make this bipartisan. And thank you, sir, for being here.
Thank you.
Let's see. Next, we have Mr. Perry.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, members of the task force. I'm not going to sit here and tell you things you already know about China, but I do want to set the stage in two ways here. I think it's important that we just acknowledge what we're dealing with in China. China is a criminal organization that has taken a country hostage over a period of many years. That's simply what it is, and we just have to acknowledge it. I know we have failed in our attempt to bring them into the community of civilized nations, and that's just a reality. But what we've just seen in Hong Kong is the modern subsuming of the Sudetenland. Just breathe that in. That's what's happening, and we're sitting here talking about it. And just the context for me is as I've been honored to serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee for a number of years since I've come to Congress, there have been many opportunities to rein China in. Legislation offered many, many times. Not one of them has come out of that committee and come to the floor. We are behind, and every second that goes by that we don't take action, we get further behind. With that, I would offer for the consideration of the task force, one of our first priorities must be to put an end to China's assiduous efforts to use our colleges and universities as platforms for their perverse ideology. They've been funding the Confucius Institutes for the past 15 years. I know you know all this. It's a state-sanctioned Marxist agenda that permeates through college campuses, and I'll remind you, what we're seeing on TV right now and across our country is a direct result, in part, of that, and we've allowed that. In February of last year, a Senate report found that nearly 70% of U.S. schools that received more than $250,000 from the Chinese government for the establishment of Confucius Institutes since 2006 failed to report that gift. Currently, there are over 81 Confucius Institutes within the United States. In May of this year, sent a letter to Congress. Reed Rubenstein, the Education Department's acting general counsel, concluded that the evidence suggests massive investments of foreign money have bred dependency and distorted the decision-making and the mission and the values of too many institutions. We want to push back on this. I think there's one potential here. I've got a bill, 3921 is the number. It's the Protecting Academic Integrity Act. The bill, which I introduced in July of 2019, would require institutions of higher education to file a disclosure report every time they receive $50,000 or more in the form of a gift or contract from a foreign nation. It also requires U.S. universities to report which department, agency, office, or division of a federal government provided the gift or contract, and finally directs a GAO to study and publicly report on the reasons U.S. universities fail to comply with current, I just remind everybody, current law. On May of this year, I offered consideration of a bill naming Hong Kong as an independent country. That might seem a little far-fetched right now, but I'm just going to tell you, with what just has happened in Hong Kong, the pretense of one country, two systems is over. We can either realize it now, or we can be the last to realize it. But that's what happened. And like I said, I'm not going to go on forever here. I just want to alert you to a couple other bills that I have for your and this task force's consideration. The prohibiting all U.S. contribution to the World Health Organization until Taiwan takes China's place. That's 6954. Just remember, President Trump is not always going to be the president. Prohibiting U.S. contributions to the UN until Taiwan takes China's place, 6946. I just listened to the conversation in Foreign Affairs in the committee regarding what sanctions were put in place when Beijing, when the Communist Party failed to live up to its obligations under the agreement for Hong Kong. You know how many sanctions there are in that agreement? Yeah, close your eyes. What do you see? Right? And we're depending on the UN. That's a recipe for failure. Finally, the Hong Kong Freedom Act and the Tibet Freedom Act. Tibet Freedom Act is 6948, and the Hong Kong Freedom Act is 6947. With that, the only other comment I'll make, I don't have a bill for it, but China has cost us untold amounts of money in this pandemic that we're never going to be able to prove how it got here out of China, whether they were making it in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, whether it got out by accident or whatever. But we can prove that they were derelict in their responsibilities to alert the world to what was happening in their country, and now it's eclipsed the globe. They owe us $1 trillion or thereabouts in sovereign debt that they have never paid, and there's absolutely no reason we shouldn't demand that before anything else happens in a relationship with China on the United States' behalf, that money comes back to the United States. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Thank you for your service in our United States military and on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Great ideas. The way they've infiltrated our universities, turning our free academic, thinking against us. I started the letters on the Confucius Institutes, and a lot of these, they had no idea that they had been penetrated. And then the 1,000 Talents program is just an outright espionage program sponsored by the PRC. And we had a Harvard University indicted last month. We had 3 at UT-MD Anderson that were trying to steal immunotherapy. They're trying to steal our vaccine right now in the cyberspace. These bills touch on a lot of points. The WHO, I called for conditioning the funding upon Tedros's resignation. How could any CEO in the private sector survive what he did when he whitewashed the entire, cover-up? I've just heard from the secretary, they have invited, by the way, the WHO to come in now after they've destroyed all evidence of the crime. And I doubt they'll get into the lab. I doubt they'll get into the market that's already been destroyed. And I doubt they're going to find any wrongdoing. The fact they control half of the United Nations makes it ineffective from our standpoint. And the human rights abuses, I know the Uyghur Muslims were touched upon, but I'm really glad you brought up the Tibetan population, the Tibetan monks. The Dalai Lama is in exile because of what his country has done to him, and not to mention the persecution of Christians in the People's Republic of China. We had my dad had Hitler in his generation. He bombed the Nazis. I grew up in the Cold War. We had 9/11, radical terror. This is the threat of our generation right now, of this generation, is the Chinese Communist Party. So I want to thank you for these great ideas and your presentation. Any questions from the members? Mr. Gonzalez.
Mr. Perry, thank you for all your work on this and for your thoughts on it. I share what I think is a common sentiment, which is that the international institutions that are supposed to be informed by Western values have basically been captured in many senses by the CCP. And that's at the World Bank, the IMF, the WHO, the UN, et cetera. And so I am fully on board with you on that. The one question that you always get is, hey, look, if you start cutting funding or the U.S. backs off, that's going to further empower China in those organizations? Or that's the question I always get when I suggest that. So I guess my question would be, what is your response to that specific pushback? And how would you see us sort of reinforming those institutions back to their original purpose?
I would say to anybody that told me that, after watching what I and many here have watched over the last 40 years, is very, very simple. Like, how's that working so far?
Yeah.
Reinforcing failure with the things that brought you to the failure don't seem to be a plan for success for me. And I think at a minimum, the United States is such a large contributor to these organizations financially, and because of our involvement, they have credibility in regarding the decisions that they make, and essentially, even though we're overruled, we become a party to those decisions, and in some oblique way an approver of those decisions. I think that this sends pulling out in many different ways and decoupling in many different ways sends a very strong signal that the free countries, the few free countries that are left in the world, strongly object and will not be a party to it until they change course. The Communist Chinese Party is no longer going to give up power or authority any more than Al Capone would, any more than the mob would, or any more than any dictatorial regime would. They're just not. They're not going to. Harsh language does not. I just heard that. Well, we're going to go to the UN. I heard this up in the committee I was just in, talking about China, and they're going to be severely rebuked. I'm sorry. These are criminals who kill people. Rebuking them does not. It's not effective. With all due respect.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next, we have Mr. Kustoff. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Chairman McCaul, and thank you to the members of the task force for allowing me to be here today. I introduced about 2 months ago, March 27th, H.R. 7033. That's the Secure Campus Act. The purpose of the bill is to put an end to the ongoing intellectual property theft, which is being perpetrated by the Chinese Communist Party across college campuses across the country. The legislation, it takes a hardline approach by banning student visas and research visas for Chinese nationals seeking graduate or postgraduate studies in STEM fields, specifically in the STEM fields. It would further prohibit the People's Republic of China, the nationals and participants in China's foreign talent recruitment programs, from reviewing or working on federal R&D grants in STEM fields. Now, the issue is not new. And if I could, I'd like to go back about 2 years. FBI Director Christopher Wray in 2018 was testifying before the Senate, and in a direct response to a question from Senator Rubio, this is his response about the threats that face our university systems. And I'm going to quote, "The use of non-traditional collectors, especially in the academic setting, whether it's professors, scientists, students, we see in almost every field office that the FBI has around the country." Now, the bottom line is that the Chinese Communist Party continues to exploit the openness of our American research enterprise to steal cutting-edge technology. According to the Department of Homeland Security, there were over 272,000 undergraduate and graduate students from China enrolled in United States universities during the 2018-2019 academic year. Of those, between 84 and 85,000 were in graduate level and science and engineering programs. That makes China the #1 source of international students to the United States. Now, here's the bottom line. If we want to get the attention of Beijing, I think this is how we do it. To highlight it even further, I'd like to point out the most recent cases opened by the Department of Justice and by the FBI. To date, the FBI says that they have 1,000 open cases related to Chinese espionage. So we're talking about everything from Fortune 500 companies to Silicon Valley startups, government, academia, high tech, even agriculture. And I think we can all recognize and appreciate that the strategies used by the People's Republic of China, they're hard to detect. While most Americans may think of academic interest as separate from business or from the military, it goes back to what Scott Perry just talked about a moment ago. The Chinese government does not. Since 2007, the People's Liberation Army, they've sponsored 2,500 military scientists and engineers to study abroad and developed a relationship with researchers and with institutions across the globe. Now, recent cases in the United States includes a former Cleveland Clinic Foundation employee charged in May with wire fraud to the tune of $3.6 million in grant funding from the National Institute of Health. In March, a West Virginia University professor pled guilty to fraud through his participation in the PRC's Thousand Talents programs. And Chairman McCaul, I think to your point a moment ago, Department of Justice announced in January that the chair of Harvard University's Chemistry and Chemical Biology Department had been charged with aiding the PRC and falsifying his collaboration as a, quote, strategic scientist at the Wuhan University of Technology. The Trump administration, through the State Department, through the Department of Justice, and through the FBI, have recognized this threat, and they've already started taking action. On May 29th, 2 days after I introduced this bill, President Trump issued a proclamation aimed at restricting the entry of graduate students and researchers from China. This legislation essentially would codify that order with the president with a national security waiver on a case-by-case basis. It would also mandate that participants in China's foreign talent recruitment programs register under the Foreign Agent Registration Act. In addition, it would require the Secretary of State to publish a list of China's foreign talent recruitment programs so that the American people, and frankly our universities, can better identify these ongoing threats and attempts at intellectual property and research theft. In conclusion, I'm working closely with Senator Tom Cotton on this issue. He's carrying the companion bill in the Senate. I look forward to working with the task force, and I'm happy to answer any questions or comments that you all may have.
Thank you, Mr. Kustoff. We appreciate and your focus on the PRC's exploitation of our open university system to not only educate their own people, they have relied on our system to educate in STEM and these higher degrees, but the extent to which they have infiltrated, I think, is very much unknown at this point. I was just talking to the secretary this morning, and I think Ray, the FBI is finally cracking down on these cases. I prosecuted the Johnny Chung case back in 1997. That the director of Chinese intelligence, China Aerospace, put money in his Hong Kong bank account to influence the presidential election because they liked President Clinton's position on aerospace and satellite technology. They steal, they infiltrate, and this is another example. I think these numbers that you cite, quite frankly, are just the tip of the iceberg. I think it's far more extensive than we possibly know. And they take advantage of the naivete, I think, of some universities and the academic openness society. which we cherish in this country. But they know how to exploit things like that and turn it against us. So I appreciate it. It's good to know there's a Senate companion bill to this as well. Do any members have any questions? Denver?
Thank you, Representative Kustoff. And I wanted to talk about a couple things. This is very timely. I was just on the Pillar 1 briefing yesterday with DHS on this very issue. So in your bill, I want to ask a couple things. Number one, I'm looking at Secure Campus Act. The reason I think this is timely, I was told, I did not know this, that there was one individual, one Chinese individual that had a student visa for 23 years. Right, that's probably a little bit longer than, we have a visa over in China. I think we're only allowed 1 year, right? So probably needs to be some reciprocity, right, with student visas where there's not unfair competition. But what do you think about expedited removal authority? We had that discussion yesterday with DHS. Your bill, looking at your bill, it might be something in there that's already there that I missed, and I apologize for that. What do you think about the ability for DHS to give some type of ability for them to expedite removal of those that are believed harmful on these campuses as part of the Secure Campus Act?
I think it's necessary. I think it's proper for the reasons that you cite. And I to go further on your point, and I mentioned this a moment ago in my remarks, and I'll piggyback on what Scott Perry talked about to you all. We have got to get the attention of Beijing. They don't play nice. They don't play fair. And going back to the comments that you made about Secretary Baker, the days of trying to befriend them and trust them are gone. We're past that. So we have to take a hardline position. We've got to take a hardline position now, and we've got to get their attention. And I think it'd be appropriate to grant DHS that authority.
Mr. Joyce?
Thank you.
Mr. Kustoff, thank you. I echo what Chairman McCall's comments and as well as Mr. Riggleman. This is important legislation that you bring forward to us. We cannot allow the openness of our education systems to continue to be violated. And we allow that. We provide IDs, we provide passcodes. We have to take these steps, and your legislation is very important in doing that. I commend you for bringing this forward, and I agree with Chairman McCall. The bicameral nature of this is very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank
Appreciate
you
you
for
being
allowing
here.
me to appear today.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Barr.
One quick question for you, and Representative Kustoff, appreciate your leadership on this, and I support your bill. I am curious to know what feedback you've received, let's say from the University of Tennessee or Memphis University, University of Kentucky has a Confucius Institute. What feedback have you received from them on this? And then secondly, from the White House and their strategic approach to China, they report that Beijing refuses to honor its commitment to provide travel documents for Chinese citizens with orders of removal from the United States. Any thought to how to deal with that problem in implementing your bill?
A couple things. One is, in fact, yesterday, the Confucius Institute at the University of Memphis closed. I've not heard anything official. It's interesting that you asked that about the University of Tennessee, because one of the professors wrote an op-ed that appeared in the Gannett papers, and he called the legislation racist and xenophobic and all the pushback that you would expect to receive from, frankly, from the liberal academia. And can you, your last question again?
The last question was, and this is from the White House strategy to China, Beijing refuses to honor its commitment to provide travel documents for Chinese citizens with orders of removal from the United States in a timely and consistent manner, effectively blocking their removal from our country. So I agree with you that we need to remove this to eliminate the threat of academic espionage, but the implementation of that, any thoughts on how we can address that problem?
Quite frankly, we're going to have to develop it. We will have to develop that procedure and make sure that we have all the I's dotted and all the T's crossed. I go back again to where we are in the calendar, and we've got limited time before the election. This problem is not going to go away. And we're going to be dealing with it. You know, I talked with executives who deal with China, and they remind me that the Chinese think in decades, where we think in quarters and in years. They're long-term committed to this strategy. We've got to adopt the universal strategy that I'm talking about here, as well as developing those procedures. Thank you very much.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, there are more student visas from the People's Republic of China than any other nation.
That's correct.
Coming into the United States. They have certainly played our universities very well with money. I think it's very attractive. And when they look at their budgets, you know, Confucius Institute pays a lot of money. They've been very crafty, I think, but very deceptive at the way they pulled this off.
And to further echo your comments, very, very strategic.
Very strategic. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate it. Next, we have Mr. Mast.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. It's nice to have the gavel again. I guess.
We'll get it back soon.
That's right. Gentleman's recognized.
I appreciate you all recognizing me. I want to speak plainly about this. In today's world, anywhere in our world, if there's an act of negligence resulting in harm, there is a debt. Doesn't matter where you are in this world. The origins, the report on the origins of COVID-19, it reads as an indictment of the negligence and cover-up that China actively participated in, allowing this to become a global pandemic. And for that, there is a debt. And I think it's incumbent upon us and the world to not allow ourselves to be naive or negligent moving forward as it relates to our response to China in what they have allowed to occur. We would be naive and negligent to think we are going to get one word of remorse, any kind of apology, a dollar, a euro, a renminbi, a peso, an ounce of gold, or anything out of China in response to their role in this. That would be naive. That's what my piece of legislation is all about. It's to empower the United States and empower the globe in recognizing that China owes a debt. We should be withholding any debt that we owe to them or any other nation owes to them on a one-for-one basis for anything that we see as a result of their negligence as it relates to COVID-19. I think that this is an effort that undoubtedly China would retaliate in. I think would be naive to think they wouldn't retaliate if us or anybody across the globe conducted these actions. That doesn't mean that it's not necessary, but I also think that this is an effort that only the United States of America could lead the world in. I don't think you will see any other nations leading the world on this effort to hold China accountable. And in that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you, sir, for presenting this bill, and thanks for mentioning this report again. It's all factual. I mean, there's no opinion, there's no spin, there's no speculation. And as a former federal prosecutor, it does read like an indictment. In fact, it is an indictment of the Chinese Communist Party and the World Health Organization and their inability to alert the world, their number one mission, to alert the world to a global pandemic, utterly failed. A CEO like that in the private sector would be gone tomorrow, and he's still there. And the CCP is still there. And I think that's the number one question I get today, particularly after people read this, is what are you going to do about it? How are you going to hold them accountable? So I think this is very insightful, and I want to thank you for bringing this. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Mr.
sir.
Chairman.
Thank you. Let's see. Next, we have Mr. Johnson.
Never want to follow Brian Mast.
It's a tough act.
Tough act.
Tough act to follow, man.
Thank y'all. Good to see you, bro. You want me to start?
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to begin by thanking the members of the task force for your important work on what is, I know we all agree, probably the largest strategic threat we face in terms of our foreign policy. We have to get this right. Just as you just said a few moments ago, we have to effectively counter the Chinese Communist Party. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have the honor, of course, of having you as a longtime member of RSC, and your leadership in this area is so instrumental, and all you guys, what you bring to the table. So glad for each one of you for being here. As you all know, RSC is, the Republican Study Committee is the largest caucus of conservatives in Congress. This Congress, we have 149 members, and y'all well know, I'm saying this for those who may be watching us, that we have separated this large organization into task forces, and we've been working in the 116th Congress in producing effectively policy manuals and prescriptions on all the greatest challenges facing the country, including national security and foreign affairs. Our task force on that point just released its important report, the RSC National Security Strengthening America and Countering Global Threats. This the publication you're each going to get. All the members of the task force will get one delivered to their offices today. This is a really important document. It has nearly 140 policy recommendations to preserve American leadership around the globe, and you'll be getting those copies. The first chapter you'll see when you open your hymnal here, the first 28 pages are devoted to this issue, to China. And that's for an obvious reason. It's an explanation of our 48 specific recommendations on this point. And I want to tell you that you'll be encouraged, as I am, that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has already publicly denounced our report, which is a good indication that we're on the right track. In a nutshell, we believe the old approach to China has failed. And as I know Chairman's made clear on a number of occasions, and all of us have, the idea that free trade and engagement with the CCP was going to somehow lead them to democratize or improve their behavior was clearly incorrect. In fact, the opposite has happened. As we know, China, under Xi Jinping, has become more aggressive on the world stage, and they've become much more repressive to their own people. President Trump is the first president in my lifetime who has brought moral and strategic clarity to the issue of our relations with China, which has been illustrated by his response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Congress has the opportunity to do more now to help push President Trump's agenda through Congress. We have some ideas on how to do that. I wanted to provide you very quickly with a few highlights of the China section of this report we just published. First, we believe we must oppose the CCP's attempts to reorient today's world order to one based on authoritarianism by standing strongly for what we all believe in, the American values of freedom and democracy and human rights and the rule of law and open markets. Second, we believe we must enhance U.S. laws safeguarding American intellectual property, modernize the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, and ensure a whole-of-government approach to stop the transfer of critical technology to China. And third, we propose bilateral trade agreements with democratic partners who are facing increasing threat or malign influence from China, including Taiwan, Indonesia, the Philippines, India, Brazil, Kenya, and others. But the primary recommendation of this report that we hope that you all will carefully consider is the proposal to seriously sanction the entire United Front Work Department and senior CCP leaders, including members of the Politburo, for their malign influence campaigns and the internment of Uyghurs and the assault on Hong Kong. The strategy proposes targeted measures rather than broad-based tariffs that may actually wind up hurting the U.S. economy. As we like to say, our recommendations are tough but targeted. We think that's what's called for today. As we know, the United Front Work Department has been the CCP party organ responsible for political warfare campaigns and much of the disinformation connected to the COVID-19 pandemic. They are experts at subversion and oppression. The United Front is spearheading efforts in China to publish a new edition of the Bible with, quote, socialist characteristics. Can't wait to see that. It's engaged in a war on religion where churches have been destroyed. Millions of Uyghur Muslims have been placed in internment camps, and Tibetan Buddhists have been brutally repressed. The United Front also runs a network of organizations within the U.S. which spy on Chinese students and American citizens and influence research at think tanks and universities. Mao Zedong called the United Front the, quote, magic weapon for the conquest of communist ideology. How frightening is that? It makes zero sense for United Front members to be granted visas into the U.S. or to have access to our financial system. A way to handle this may be to create a new sanctions authority to go after state-based disinformation networks which harm U.S. national policy and use that authority to mandate sanctions on the United Front. Congress could also require determination into whether or not the United Front or any division of it, including its two overseas work bureaus or overseas Chinese affairs and religious work bureaus, meet the criteria to be sanctioned under current authorities, including executive orders prohibiting cyber attacks, human rights sanctions under the Global Magnitsky Act, or recently passed Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. At the very least, Congress could use these current authorities to study and make proper determinations about the leadership of the United Front. Sanctioning the United Front is not a mere symbolic gesture. It could very well disrupt networks of CCP, espionage, and disinformation in the U.S. Organizations affiliated with the United Front could still operate, but they'd have to disconnect from the United Front party architecture, and the United Front operatives would no longer be allowed to conduct their activities directly on U.S. soil. I'd like to again thank you all for your work, for Chairman McCaul for your leadership in putting this important initiative together. The RSC looks forward to working with you all to pursue our common goals, and we hope you'll consider including a number of this report's carefully considered 48 policy recommendations with regard to China in your final recommendations.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson, and I want to thank the RSC. And I've been a member since day one, and it's really the conservative think tank of the conference, kind of like the Heritage Foundation. These are very practical and strategic, in my view. Very much looking forward to reading the report. I want to congratulate you on your immediate condemnation by the Chinese Communist Party. This report got immediately condemned. I think we've been in the Beijing papers possibly 5-10 times now.
I'm just trying to be more like you. Yes, yes.
And they follow this.
Of course.
This makes them nervous. This hearing makes them nervous.
It does.
It's
That's why it's so important.
It's because it's important, and we know it is, and the Democrats ought to be here.
They should.
They should be here with us.
And it means a lot when not only this group and all the experts and all of you guys with your expertise and insight, to also have a large group of 149 members of Congress who are united behind this. This is a big block, and a lot of us who are deeply concerned. And I hope they hear this message loud and clear. So
they're listening.
Yeah,
trust me.
We're behind you 100%.
They're listening right now. Their disinformation campaign you talked about. I mean, blaming the United States military for COVID-19.
Incredible.
Absolutely preposterous. And I liked your comments about the president, first one in my lifetime to stand up to the Chinese Communist Party. When he did the travel ban from China, he probably protected hundreds of thousands of lives in this country.
That's right.
And guess who criticized him immediately? The Chinese Communist Party and the WHO.
We're in good company.
So we are in good company. It's a badge of honor, I think, that we share. This report will be taken very seriously by the task force. And I want to thank all the members who participated in putting this together. It's going to be a great resource for our final report and recommendations. Any questions? Yeah, Denver?
First, I want to thank you for your leadership in the RSC. It's been really incredible to see what you've been doing in there, Representative Johnson. So I have a question for you about the sanctions. We talked about the United Front. I don't know if the American people know this. The data is old, but I think, what is it, the China's version of our Congress would hold $500 billion in wealth, right? And that United Front, right, and what they do, you have people that are actually in Congress that are worth over $40 billion each, right? That's why state-owned enterprises and everything you hear about is true. My question for you is, do you see a cascading effect if we had, because I absolutely agree with what you're saying, that we can stop some of the technology issues that we have with IP theft and stuff like that, right? But looking at the RSC report, what I think is so good is that if you start there with sanctions, we're able to get a hold on the technological theft that we have also, and also the data points you make in the RSC report. Do you have any comments on that and why that is so important to make sure that we go after those individuals that are using state-owned enterprises really as a cudgel against the United States?
They absolutely are, and it's fully sanctioned by the CCP, as we all know, and that's the problem. We have to call it out for what it is. We hear from all of our constituents and leaders in every industry who are deeply concerned about the theft of intellectual property. It's a big issue. I serve on the House Judiciary Committee. We have jurisdiction over some of these issues, and we've talked about many ideas to do it. We need bipartisan consensus to address that, and there are some sound proposals on the table. We include some here. But the idea that we could allow this to go much further, they damage every single American when they do this. When they steal and have open thievery of intellectual property, it hurts every single person in this country. And we have to recognize that, take it seriously, and make it a top priority. And again, I'm so glad President Trump has prioritized that. But it's going to take the momentum, the inertia that we have as us in the body here to push that forward. And so The time for this is critical, and you're absolutely right. And I do have great hope we can address that and get the international community involved as well. One of the things we're talking about is providing a forum where there's liability, where they have responsibility for this, and where we can go into international tribunals and even perhaps courts in the U.S. and have jurisdiction over the big offenders. And again, tough but targeted. We have no quarrel with the Chinese people. It's with the leaders who are the aggressors here and the thieves. And that's
Thank
really
you, Chairman.
Yeah, I think the director of the NSA, the admiral, put it best. He says the largest transfer of wealth in human history, stolen intellectual property. They don't do a lot of innovation, but they're pretty good at stealing ours.
Exactly right.
And I think that just let me thank you again personally as chairman, and thank your membership for this valuable report.
Glad to help. Thank you all for the time.
Thank you. Let's see, next we have Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I like to think I'm Mr. China, but I think you are Mr. China, and Chinese Communist Party, I should say. I really want to just start out by thanking you for your service to Congress, but also the Foreign Affairs Committee. Nobody knows this issue better than you on the committee.
Appreciate it.
And you've provided so much leadership that I personally value tremendously. So thank you.
No, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you guys, everybody on this panel, and I can't tell you how important this panel is. I'm leaving Congress at the end of this term. It's going to be up to you guys and future Congresses and administrations to get this right. The largest challenge we're going to face is an aggressive China. Since World War II, we've not seen this kind of disruption in the world norm, I'll say. It'll be up to the future Congresses to make sure that we get this right, and the policies, the things I've heard today are good, and we want to continue that. But to understand how to deal with China or the China threat, one must understand their intent. Their goal is world domination. Make no mistake about this. Michael Pillsbury's book, if you've not read it, The 100-Year Marathon, you need to read it.
That's the best.
Rosemary Gibson's China RX, one of the persons in there, the actions of the strategy of China was to corner the market. And one of their leaders said the best way to beat your enemy is move into their house, in their land. They've done that. They've got manufacturing companies here not just with pharmaceuticals. They've got the world leaders in car glass in Dayton, Ohio. They're manufacturing this. President Obama did a pretty good documentary called American Factory. Get the information. And you guys are already up to speed on this. When you look at China and you look at Deng Xiaoping back in the 80s, he said, hide your strength, bide your time. They knew they couldn't match or compete with the U.S. or Japan in electronics manufacturing, so they set a goal to corner the market on rare earth metals. And guess what they did? 90% of the rare earth metals that this country gets comes directly from China. The other 10% come from countries that get it from China. Vitamins and minerals. People don't think about that, but 100% of our vitamins and minerals that go into our livestock feed with the medication for medicated feed come from China. Talk to your fertilizer people. The majority of our trace elements and minerals that go into fertilizer come from China. Syngenta, the world's largest agrochemical company in the world, is owned by China. 1/3 of all ag seeds are produced by that company. 35% of the world's DNA sequencing machines are owned by China. And we can have a discussion about why that is important. I'll be happy to talk to anybody about that. And the list goes on. Understand what Xi Jinping said. This was in 2017 at the 19th Communist Party Congress. The era of China has arrived. No longer will we be made to swallow our interest around the world. It's time for China to take the world center stage. I mean, it's pretty evident in what they're going to do. They have a blue water navy. They're building 5 aircraft carriers. They're securing the second chain of islands in the South Pacific. They have control and building the string of pearl ports around the world. You look at the ports in Djibouti. You look at them in the other regions in that area. You see what they're doing. It's very clear. They control both sides of the Panama Canal. They're threatening the Indo-Pacific. They're threatening the South and the East China Sea. They're dredging land masses, and I refuse to call them islands, because if you call them islands, you give them legitimacy. They are not islands. They are dredged land masses that they have absolutely no claim. They don't honor international law or norms. The Philippines took them to court. China lost. They ignored it. They were here in the White House with President Obama and said in 2015, Xi Jinping says there's no goal of ours to militarize those islands. Yet today they're heavily militarized, offensive and defensive weapons. They have bases on there, they have troops on there, and the march goes on, and nobody does anything about it. The pandemic, I mean, we can talk about that, but you guys have already talked about that. They have a space program. They own Smithfield hog operations, the largest pork producer in our country. They control that. And we need to put a marker down, as Scott said, about Taiwan. I've been very vocal about Taiwan, and I support their sovereignty. And I think it's time for this nation to call for full diplomatic recognition of Taiwan as a nation. And it's going to cause a hellstorm. But if we do not lay that marker down today, is it going to be possible in 3 years? You guys are all familiar with the ASEAN bloc of nations, I assume. 653 million people, about $3 trillion in trade. They have a compact that they don't interfere with the politics of another nation. And I have sat with Prime Minister Lee of Singapore, I've sat with the incoming chair of Vietnam, and pleaded with them to come together and change that, because that agreement was made over 50 years ago. The world has changed. They've got a very aggressive nation that wants to take over, not just them, but the rest of us. They have to come together as a bloc. And it's time for them to come together with our support. And I told them it would not just be you standing up to China. It would be us. It would be Australia. It would be the Great Britain. It would be Germany. Hell, even the French said they would come out there in the Navy, with their Navy. You would also see Japan, India, Australia, South Korea. And if we stand up collectively, China has no force. Nobody is advocating for a kinetic conflict with China. But economically, we can get their attention. Xi Jinping cannot afford that pressure at home. I do have some bills I wanted to go over real quickly. Sure. We have the Enforcing Accountability and Transparency in International Trade. I call it the Eat It Act, because China today is still hiding under developing nation status at the WTO. They have the second largest economy. I mean, the Blue Water Navy, a space program, come on. And so what this does is it kind of removes them from that status so they can't hide behind that. We have the Taiwan Fellowship Act, which creates a 2-year fellowship program, and it's bipartisan. It's in the Senate. I believe it's Senator Rubio, and I can't remember the other one that's on that. But it's kind of like the Japanese Fellowship Act that we have that's been very successful, the Mansfield program. And then we've got a bill that directs the Secretary of State to develop a strategy to regain observer status for Taiwan in the World Health Organization. It's passed the House, and it's passed in the Senate as an Inhofe bill, and they're going to merge them together. So this is something that we can continue to do. Brad Sherman and I just introduced the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, which will put sanctions on people that are doing human rights violations in China. In addition, on our committee, where I had the privilege to be the chair of the Asia Pacific Committee last Congress, we put letters to the Treasury and to the State Department to make sure we follow up on the sanctions for these companies that are funneling money to North Korea and allowing North Korea to exist or not come to the table. China, as you guys know, does 90% of the trade with North Korea. They are on the UN Security Council. There's 15 members. All 15 voted unanimously to put sanctions on China. China backed off of those sanctions and is allowing North Korea to continue their nuclear program that we're all going to pay for. And so, again, these actions are tough. But if we do not act as a nation and get our allies to act, is it going to be possible 3 to 5 years from now? And I'll leave you guys with that. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. And I appreciate again,
No, thank
Chairman
you.
Mike, to allow me to do what I've done.
Stay seated for a second. I just want to, again, thank you for your expertise. I think nobody knows this issue better than you do. Maybe Pillsbury, who, by the way, we're going to call Pillsbury before the task force to talk about his book.
That's awesome.
Where he talks about the decades of deception where he was deceived as a CIA operative. And he finally kind of woke up, as I think the American people have woken up after COVID-19, to what are we dealing with. It's interesting, talking at the State Department this morning, the CCP is fearful of us, but you know who they're most fearful? Their own people.
Yeah.
That their own people are going to wake up to what they're doing, to the oppression, the persecution, the constant surveillance that goes on. And that's who I think the Chinese Communist Party fears the most. The idea that they're a developing nation is laughable.
It is.
They're an economic empire, and yet they can go to the World Bank and get these subsidized loans that they loan out to the debt trap developing nations. I want to also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention your tremendous work on competing with China. And when I talk about that, I talk about the BUILD Act.
Oh, heck, I forgot to mention that.
That is, I think, out of all the legislation I've seen come out of Foreign Affairs Committee, this one probably has the biggest impact.
Thank you.
And certainly the biggest impact on our ability to compete with China. And the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation that came out of that, is our response to the private sector and us investing, the United States government, which returns to the Treasury, returns money. It actually makes a profit. Working together, we can compete with them in Africa and in Latin America. The president invoked the Defense Production Act, and he put Mr. Bowler, who's the head of the DFC, in charge of trying to decouple national security products from China. I talked to the ambassador of Afghanistan just the other day. She's working with the DFC on rare earth minerals. Remember, we spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, and then we let the Chinese come in and exploit the rare earth minerals. It's about time, I think, the United States gets something from our investment in that country. And I'm pleased to see that we will.
Can I add one more thing about the
Sure.
DFC? We passed the DFC last Congress. It got signed into law. It needs to have equity authority. This is something that's going to come up in the appropriations. It's something that you need to fight for. The reason China can do what they do is their Belt Road Initiative, that they have no oversight, no Congress. They can do that because of their form of government. We need to be able to compete with them on a level playing field. And I truly believe if we bring American businesses into that realm, there's nobody going to do business better than we are, because we bring the rule of law, and this is something we really do. And as you brought up the Defense Production Act, President Trump, first time ever, signed where we can use foreign affairs money for a 2-year period only, and it's out of the DFC. It's $6 billion to secure supply chains, primarily in PPEs, APIs, which are your active pharmaceutical ingredients. And I thank you for mentioning that. I meant to bring that
Yeah,
up.
I think the equity authority, because and this is coming from a member of the Freedom Caucus, right? But the fact is they invest very wisely, and there's a return to the Treasury.
43 out of 44 years in the OPEC model. They are I think it was in 2016, they were appropriated $63 million. They returned $265 million. So that's a pretty good deal.
And it's a great, this is our answer to competing with China. And then finally, I think we talk about consequences, talk about the damage they've done, but you know what? The biggest, I think, stick in the eye would be recognizing Taiwan as a legitimate nation.
It is. And
I think that would be the most punitive thing that we could consider.
I think that would be good. And, we're Americans. We don't come in second, so.
Yes, Andy.
Congressman Yoho, first of all, thank you very, very much for your leadership on these issues. As the former chairman of Asia Pacific, there's no member of Congress who has more expertise and insight on this issue than you do. And we really appreciate
Well,
that.
I appreciate that.
I hate that you're leaving Congress.
Yeah, me too.
You deserve it. But as a classmate of mine, Ted, you're I agree with the chairman. Your legacy here, there's a lot of legacies you have, but what you did with the Build Act and the DFC is a great legacy for you. And I had the privilege of meeting with Mr. Bowler. And in addition to the Equity Authority, I just wanted to kind of tap into your expertise here. What else do we need to do to empower DFC that you created out of OPIC? What else do we need to do to bring DFC up to speed and give it the authorities it needs to counter China?
I think that right there is the biggest thing, and the other thing is engaging in countries around the world. You know, you're not going to fix every country, but if you go like into the Northern Triangle in Central America, you could do a regional compact in that area like MCC does and do significant infrastructure projects. And by doing those significant infrastructure projects, that's the very genesis of an economy. Because you can't have an economy. We can teach people how to grow cattle or, you know, to do stuff in Africa, but if they don't have roads and refrigeration and electricity, you can't develop an economy. So if we're strategic about this, and Adam Bowler is probably the perfect person to run that with his enthusiasm, his acumen, by doing that and invite our businesses down there, those are the ones that are going to do the investment to create the manufacturing, that's going to create a job market, that's going to create the trade, and that trade becomes to where we can weed countries off of aid, and we move from aid to trade, and that was the whole reason that the primary reason for the Build Act. The second was to counter what China's doing. And so equity authority is a must. It has to happen. If not, it's like having a grand piano that's real nice, a Steinway sitting there, and you go out to play, and you haven't taken any lessons, and you do chopsticks. You know, China is waiting for us to fail at this, and some other nations. We got to hit the ground running. And I think if we do that and engaging the State Department and let the people in the State Department know of this tool that they have, I think we can do that. We had a reception for the Build Act, and it was amazing the amount of people that came there. We had MCC there. We had USAID. MCC said, can you guys do a reception for us like this and have the people from the DFC there? The DFC, and you know, I get a lot of credit for that bill. That was a team effort. We couldn't have done that had it not been for the people in this room, the Democrats, bicameral in the Senate, and the administration was behind it. I'm happy my name was on it, but it was a team effort, and that's the way America should work, because we had a goal. We all got behind that goal, and we made it happen, and it's going to be something that'll make this country stronger in the future. And again, I thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Yeah, Mr. Riggleman?
Yeah, and I won't be too long, because I'm going to piggyback off Andy, because we met with Adam Bowler, but also some other individuals you might be familiar with in the DFC. And I'm going to use, so I like acronyms, you know, I'm prior military, and by the way, I'm going to miss you.
Can't help yourself, huh?
Do you see the DFC along with USAID, along with Export-Import Bank? You see almost the fact with the Build Act and what you've done, it almost seems to me that you set up a structure for PETs, right? Prioritized economic targets.
Yeah.
Right? And the ability to do prioritized economic targets means we need to have a lot of information sharing and data across every single one of those specific entities, right? And that's what we've been talking about. Is there a time now where we can do data-driven prioritized investment based on what the Build Act has done? Everybody, I know I'm giving you so much credit, but I should, right? But what you did with the Build Act, is this the time where we're setting a new front, right, based on Chinese hegemonic interest? We're setting a new front where the economy is almost becoming, I don't want to say the word warfare, but it's almost becoming another area we can use our free market institutions in order to ensure, you know, that markets stay free. Do you see that that's where we're at with the DFC or people like that leading that sort of effort, right, to prioritize the economic targets we have around the world?
That's a must. I mean, that has to happen. And I have sat with our ambassadors. I've sat with the representatives from the different countries, whether it's their minister, their ambassador, their presidents. What do you need in your country? You've got to find out what that need in that country is. And I think one of the biggest things we need to pivot away from is social issues. Yes, we believe in equality and gender inequality and all these things, but when you open that up with that, people run away. I'll give you an example. I had a guy, we were up at the UN National or General Assembly, our representative at the IMF, I think it was, and he said he was at a meeting and it was to build roads. Well, our mandate was they had to be a gender-neutral road. That's what I did. I laughed. I'm like, what do you mean? He was pissed. I'm sorry, probably can't say that. He was mad. He goes, what the blankety blank is a gender-neutral road? He goes, I have no idea. There's no language, but our people are saying it's got to be a gender-neutral road or we can't build it. What do you think that country's going to do? When the United States is saying that, they're going to go to China and says, give me my money. And China said this, it was my first year in Congress, and I got dinged on it. China says, and I don't want to be like China, understand me. They said, we don't tell people how to live, we just invest, and they reap the benefit of that. We don't want to do that. We want to invest in that nation for the betterment of that nation, because we know if we get in there with our corporations, with the rule of law, with the things that we bring, that eventually comes good governance, becomes better human rights. And we need to work on, when we go into a country, the PETS idea is I think, is imperative, but instead of focusing on building a strong democracy, I think we should first focus on a stable government. Because Vietnam is our 16th or 20th largest trading partner. They're not a democracy, but they're a pretty good partner of ours. And so I think we should focus on that, knowing that they will eventually come our way with economic freedom, unlike China. All right.
Ted, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. We'll miss you.
You too, man. Tried to talk you out of it, but next, recognize Mr. Keller. Good afternoon.
I almost said good morning. It's morning somewhere, I guess. Thank you, Chairman McCaul and members of the China Task Force. I appreciate the work that Republican leader Kevin McCarthy and the task force and the members of the force are taking these Chinese Communist Party threats seriously and working to shed light on and bring attention to them. For too long, our supply chain, including critical defense and medical goods, have been overly reliant on resources located and produced within the People's Republic of China, under the absolute control of the Chinese Communist Party. One area of supply crucial to the United States and Pennsylvania's 12th Congressional District is tungsten, with the district being home to the domestic base of global tungsten powders, which are used in critical defense products like penetrators, artillery projectiles, and tank shells. The U.S. Geological Survey designated tungsten as a critical mineral. Additionally, the fiscal year 2019 National Defense Authorization Act prohibited the acquisition of certain tungsten products from China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. At latest count, China controls about 80% of the tungsten mining in the world and remains by far the world's leading producer of tungsten. As it does with other things, China uses its supply dominance to manipulate the global market. Given what has been exposed about China's intentions during COVID-19, and with China's growing military influence throughout the world, it is clear that we need to ensure domestic production of this critical metal. That is why, going forward, the United States and our allies will no longer have to rely on foreign sources, especially China, for any of our tungsten supply. Similarly, the manufacture of crucial medical supplies like personal protective equipment and pharmaceutical products must be brought back to the United States. In Europe, China used their dominance in PPE and pharmaceutical production to trade their critical supplies of these for wall-away contracts in what was called glove diplomacy. China demonstrated absolute arrogance by unleashing a global pandemic and then trading needed medical supplies for its state-run companies' foreign influence that then allows them to steal information and whittle away at global security and privacy. The United States, as the only world superpower and the greatest human force for good in the world, cannot allow itself or our allies to be subject to these Chinese shadow aggression because we are reliant on them for supplies. Too much of what Americans use in their daily lives is stamped with the words "Made in China." Our objective must be that we examine the devastating toll coronavirus has had on the world. We work to make sure the United States' most critical supplies are stamped with "Not made in China" as a symbol of America's self-reliance and ingenuity. That's why I'm here today, to really highlight what's happened. We have become energy independent, which has benefited us and our allies. Critical medical minerals are also important. Global tungsten powders located in the Pennsylvania's 12th Congressional District has been actually part of work. We've worked with them on making sure that we don't buy from the bad guys, and that was part of some of the things in making sure that the National Defense Authorization Act had those provisions in it. I'm here to support the legislation my colleagues have been discussing because of how important it is, not just for us, but for our allies and the world.
Thank you, Mr. Keller. And you're spot on. And this is one of the central areas of focus for the task force is supply chain. We are way too reliant, far too dependent, and therefore very vulnerable to the People's Republic of China. And I like the focus, particularly we have to focus on, nobody realized until after COVID-19 about the supply chain. They wouldn't even know what supply chain meant. But when they realized that 90% of our generics come from China, the medical equipment. But I like the way you target defense and medical things related to national security. I think when we look at decoupling or whatever you want to call it, I think that's where you really have to provide most of your focus on because that's so critical to our own national security. We have to produce these advanced semiconductor chips in the United States that our DoD relies on so much. If we don't, we're vulnerable. And so anyway, your point is very well taken by this task force. I can't think of, again, it's a wake-up call for Americans. My God, we had no idea. We were so vulnerable and relied on China at the same time. So I appreciate your testimony, sir. And any questions, comments? Andy?
Yeah, Mr. Keller, thank you very much for underscoring how important this issue of critical minerals is. And one thing that Pennsylvania and Kentucky have in common is our abundance of coal. And as climate change concerns grow and as coal production and coal employment declines, one opportunity for Pennsylvania and Kentucky and the United States is to look into coal as a source of rare earth elements to decrease our dependence on China and other foreign sources. Have you, in your interactions with your constituents in Pennsylvania, talked about this and how we can, work with a new coal industry to decrease our dependence on China?
Yeah, we've actually had those discussions, and really for me, it started with Global Tungsten, because when they came to me and said, hey, look at all these, the production of tungsten and what we use it for our national defense, and realizing the magnitude of how much we're reliant on China and people who are not friendly to us for this. And we actually, in the United States, could produce enough for our own use. We just need to make sure we're doing that, just like with the coal. So that's the discussions we've been having, whether it's been coal or tungsten or other minerals. We really are focused on that, and I would be happy to work with anybody on legislation, on policy, to get us there, because we have some great people in PA 12 that have been doing this. I know they worked with my predecessor, Congressman Marino, on some things, and we've sort of picked up there on that front because it is so important, not just for the United States, but for our allies and security around the globe.
Yeah, and it brings manufacturing and jobs back home, and honestly, it's a bipartisan issue. Supply chain, we have a semiconductor bill. Part of it's going to be in the NDAA that's bipartisan, and that's the way I think a lot of this should be. But when it comes to national security, it's about being American.
I think we in America need to start talking more about what unites us and what our common goals are for the success of our constituents. Because I don't look at people as Republican or Democrat. I look at us as Americans, and that's the first thing we need to be focused on, so that the values of our great republic remain for many generations to come.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Keller.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Next, we recognize Ms. Gonzalez-Colon. Thank you for being so patient.
Thank you, Chairman McCaul, for allowing us to be here and actually for hosting this hearing. I want to say thank you as well to Leader McCarthy for actually taking this seriously. And I think taking decisive action, creating this task force will allow us to discuss tangible solutions to counter Chinese aggression. In that sense, whether it's through the establishment of Confucius Institutes throughout our college campuses, or by buying influence throughout Latin America, or by defying international rules, the World Health Organization to cover up the COVID-19 outbreak, we know China, who China is, and has never been a friend of the United States, not to our way of life. Having said that, this pandemic has made even more evident that we can no longer afford to put our health security at the hands of our adversaries. That is why in early this year, I testified on the Defense Subcommittee in Appropriations to use the Defense Production Act to stimulate domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing. As well as in April of this year, I introduced the bipartisan bill H.R. 6443, the Securing the National Supply Chain Act, and I will soon be filing an amended version of this legislation known as the MEDS Act. We've been having discussions with the White House in that sense with Dr. Peter Navarro to see how we can come together in that effort. These proposals build on the President's actions to have a secure and resilient national stockpile, break our reliance on China, and instead promoting pharmaceutical and medical supply production here at home. The Medical Manufacturing Economic Development and Sustainability Act will establish federal tax and other incentive for current and repatriated manufacturing operations in distressed zones in the United States, areas of extremely high poverty and prevalent unemployment across the entire nation, not just Puerto Rico. Specifically, the bill would allow to provide dollar-for-dollar credit against federal taxes to U.S. companies for the wages and capital investment made in the distressed zones, and for purchases made by manufacturing from within the distressed zone. The bill will also seek to incentivize research, development, manufacturing of population health drugs that, because of their low cost, are especially prone to offshoring. Puerto Rico can play a leading role in our efforts to bring back the manufacturing companies to the U.S. and create, of course, a well stockpile in the U.S. Currently, 12 of the top 20 pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies in the world have manufacturing operations in Puerto Rico. Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, Merck, Amgen, Eli Lilly, Abbott, AbbVie, Glaxo, Novartis, Teva, among many others. We do have 49 FDA plants right now operating in Puerto Rico. We also manufacture half of the 2018 world's top 10 best-selling drugs, including Humira. That means that since 2005, manufacturers have invested more than $1 billion in infrastructure in Puerto Rico, boosting the world's largest modular biotechnology plant for producing recombinant human insulin. Puerto Rico is also home to medical device manufacturing sites, producing surgical and medical instruments, ophthalmic goods, dental equipment, orthodontic goods, dentures, appliances, and laboratory apparatus and furniture, such as Medtronic and Abbott Medical Optics. Those are just two among the top medical equipment and supply companies. We do have aerospace with Honeywell and many others producing on the island as well. So the island has a long history of pharmaceutical manufacturing and counts with a highly skilled workforce knowledgeable in GMP, FDA, and other global regulations. The island university system has also invested in a highly skilled workforce by turning out a steady stream of new talent, which are highly sought by the likes of NASA. With this bill and the new one that we're going to be filing this week, we got a unique opportunity to bring back those productions to the U.S., spur the economy in distressed areas around the nation, including Puerto Rico. I think we need to fire China and hire Puerto Rico. I think that's the way to do it. We got opportunity, we got the talent, we know how to do it, and we're ready to do business. And I think we do comply with all the federal regulations that China will never do. they're always stealing our intellectual property. Why having all those pharmaceuticals or those plants doing that in China when you can have it across the nation? In that sense, I thank you again. I'm ready
Thank
for
you so much.
answering any question. And actually, I just passed a presentation with more details of the areas I was discussing.
Well, I think you have a great campaign slogan. Be a good bumper sticker too. Yeah, I find it fascinating that there is so much infrastructure in Puerto Rico. And by the way, thank you for your representation of the Puerto Rican people.
Thank you.
And I know many of your predecessors served with them in Congress. And I find it interesting. And we had so much invested. And then I guess with some of the expiration of tax provisions, that some of these companies left and went to China. And I think we have to incentivize manufacturing in the United States and our territories and bring these manufacturers back and the jobs. So I'm completely in agreement with you. And I'd like to revive, and Puerto Rico is doing great in this area, but we can, I think, make it stronger. And through, I think, tax provisions and grant programs and federal state match programs, incentivize this to come back. And I like the Fire China, Hire Puerto Rico line. And with that, I'll yield to my colleagues for any questions.
Great to see you, and it was terrific to go down to Puerto Rico last year and see the beautiful island. You're so lucky to represent those great people down there. And my question on the bill that you have in front of us, does this bill restore the tax incentives that expired that resulted in the exodus?
No.
Okay, what does this do?
No, this bill is combining not just tax incentive, but also processes between FDA, BARDA, Investment Act, GAIN Act, among others, because it needs to be a package.
Right.
So it will provide also business-to-business depreciation of the investment in the facilities on the island, and I will try and we'll try to pick up. I see this in three ways: retaining the ones that we have, bringing back those who left, and bringing the new ones that are doing business in India and Asia. And I think with all the goods that are here, and in the Senate, Senator Marco Rubio are going to be filing a companion bill, or this with Senator McCaul. In the House, this is a bipartisan bill. So we got Congressman King, Bishop, Shalala, and Soto supporting this. I mean, we need to be creative. We don't want to have some kind of tax incentive that will have a sunset, because then it will happen again. So we need to rely on incentives that are not going to a loophole to just make rich some CFCs or companies around the world. We need to give them something that they can come back home, produce, and that's the reason we are using the distress zones. So it's going to be in the whole United States, but of course, we are going to be having 43% of poverty level in Puerto Rico. We do have the infrastructure in the whole island to make this happen. Maybe not in North Dakota, maybe not in the south of Mississippi. Like, they will qualify as a distress zone. We are using kind of the opportunity zone idea, but having just the poverty level between 30 to 40%. So those areas will be allowed to receive a more detailed incentive, and that incentive is to bring them back. But it's not going to be just a blank white blanket to see who's coming. What we're trying to do with this is actually picking which companies we want to have back. One of them is population drugs. Those are made in China. Why? Because they're low cost. There's no new research or development in those drugs. And we're talking about heart diseases, diabetes, among others. And that's the reason you got the American Heart Association actually supporting these kind of bills. Because it's the first time somebody's trying to get more research and development in those kind of population drugs that can be made in Puerto Rico. So I think the infrastructure of the bill and the new amendments that we're going to be filing this week will include a broader way not just to have a tax incentive, but that tax incentive need to be related to the job creation, to the investment, and of course, giving more time to those drugs to be used, the exclusivity of those drugs, the permits of FDA, a fast track process to establish that kind of plant back home. And we still got even former plants that are ready to use. So this is not something about building up something, in 5 years. We can do it right now. And the,
Gonzalez, one other quick follow-up. Have you all talked to some of the CEOs of the major pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer, Eli, Merck? Is this what they say they need to come to Puerto Rico?
Yeah, we're working with them.
Okay.
With the Pharmaceutical Industrial Association, with the industrial cluster in Puerto Rico. Actually, last 2 weeks ago, President Trump sent the recovery officer to the island, Admiral Brown, and we went visiting two of these pharmaceutical industries as well as the infrastructure facilities of like power and on the island. Why? Because this is something that I think there's no other state more prepared to do this than Puerto Rico right now. We got a talent. We got all of the good ingredients. We just need the jump start, and Congress need to do that. We need to do something by executive order in terms of having the FDA and the trade to forbid. And I included in this presentation some of the bills that are already been filed in the House by several members and in the Senate that I think together will give us a great opportunity to beat China.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation, and it's well received. And I also like the idea also that this will, in terms of safety of medications and the fidelity of the medications. Well, it's a territory of the United States that will be able. The FDA can, rather than taking drugs from China, we don't know how they were made. So
even the raw materials,
yeah,
the components. I think this experience of COVID should lead us to think about if we want to remain having all those medicines and drugs being made in China, or we want to have it in a secure place.
Well, thank you so much again, and look forward to adding this to our list.
Thank you.
It's great. And next we have Mr. French Hill, been very patient. It's probably one of the smartest testimonies.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the task force. Thank you for convening this set of hearings for members to bring their ideas before you. And I commend our Republican leadership for forming the task force and the work you're doing to bring the best ideas to fight the virus and restore our economy to full capacity while we deal with the issue of China. I'm really disappointed personally that Speaker Pelosi declined to appoint key leaders from the majority. Our long-term strategy related to China, military, scientific, academic, economic, must have a bipartisan approach to it. Also, I'm glad to see my friends from the House Financial Services Committee, Mr. Barr, Mr. Gonzalez, Mr. Riggleman. They've been a terrific leader on our committee on issues related to China that's been referenced today several times in terms of the World Bank and the One Belt, One Road issue. Today, I want to turn my attention to testify in front of you about Securing America's Vaccines for Emergencies Act. As we all know, on March 18th, President Trump invoked the Defense Production Act, a legacy of the Korean conflict. Over the years, the use of the DPA has evolved and been reauthorized more than 50 times. It was amended to treat energy as a defense production important issue. It was amended to include strategic minerals as a defense production initiative. It was amended to include technology. It was also expanded to go beyond the defense of the country to also dealing with national emergencies, including man-made disasters. So today, a broad set of authorities that provides the President can be used to ensure American manufacturing capabilities can meet our national defense requirements in times of conflict or emergency. The jurisdiction for the DPA falls under the House Financial Services Committee's Subcommittee on National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy, on which I currently serve as the ranking member. and my distinguished friend, Mr. Barr, is a former chairman of that subcommittee. That's when I saw the novel coronavirus spread through the United States in early March. I saw the need for crucial legislation to amend the DPA, and it was clearly apparent. So I introduced H.R. 6399, the SAVE Act, to amend the DPA to use its authority to include our medical supply chain, our vaccines, our pharmaceuticals, and medical devices. Senator Martha McSally has introduced the companion legislation in the Senate, and your colleagues, Riggleman, Gonzalez, are co-sponsors of this legislation. We need to use our free market system plus the DPA to make sure that we have a strategy to diversify our supply chain for our pharmaceuticals and medical supplies. This bill, simply put, was created with the intent of making our nation less dependent on one country like China and too few companies for the crucial and critical ingredients that go into pharmaceuticals that our citizens use every day. To put that in perspective, the impetus of the SAVE Act, a recent study from the Council on Foreign Relations, shows that 97% of all antibiotics consumed in the U.S. come from China. We can do better than that. Further, 80% of all active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, come from outside the United States, and 40% of our drug final manufacturing is all outside the United States. My legislation requires the President to create a strategy to diversify our medical supply chain to ensure that America will not be able to be dependent on outside resources. That we'll have instead a reliable and necessary source of medical and pharmaceutical supplies in the short, medium, and long term. I encourage you to prioritize the SAVE Act as a part of your consideration for the task force. We must learn from our experiences over the years, learn from those who've gone before us who've amended the Defense Production Act to take into account for changing conditions. And these solutions, in my view, will be keep our nation safer, reduced at risk, and now in a public health emergency as opposed to simply a defense issue. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Look forward to your questions. I wish you also a happy 4th of July.
Well, you too, sir. And thank you for being here and for your testimony and the legislation. We've talked a lot about supply chain, so I don't want to repeat myself, but I like the idea. 95% of our antibiotics, that's just absolutely incredible. Stunning. And I think most people didn't realize that until COVID-19. My question is, the President did invoke the Defense Production Act, and he put the head of the DFC sort of in charge of this. Would this in some ways